Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone from everywhere in the world. So my name is Jörg Hoy. I'm going to do the introduction to today's seminar. So first of all, thank you very much for coming. And this is the second of a series of events as a part of the dialogue on philosophy and technology, the research seminar series running from fall and spring 2022. This series is initiated by the Cosmotechnics Research Project, supported by the City University of Hong Kong, in collaboration with the Research Network for Philosophy and Technology. And today's event brings together the editors of two major new leading reference works on the philosophy of engineering and technology, Diane Michelfelder and Shannon Vallor, to share their perspective on the field. And this dialogue will be hosted by Carl Mitcham, a contributor to both volumes. So I'm going to briefly introduce Carl Mitcham. I think most of you know him and his work, but nonetheless, I'm going to do a brief introduction and then I'll leave to Carl to introduce the two speakers today and to continue with the dialogue. So Carl Mitcham is International Distinguished Professor of Philosophy of Technology at the Jinmin University of China in Beijing, and the Emeritus Professor of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado. I also had a chance to pay him a visit a few years ago. His publications include Thinking Through Technology, The Path Between Engineering and Philosophy, published in 1994, Encyclopedia of Science, Technology, and Ethics, a total of 4 volumes, published in 2005, Oxford Handbook of Interdisciplinarity, published in 2010 with Robert Forstmann and Julie Thompson Klein. Ethics and Science, an Introduction, published together with Adam Brigo in 2012. And most recently, Steps Towards a Philosophy of Engineering, Historical, Philosophical, and Critical Essays, published in 2020 with Rowman and Littlefield International in London. So Carl is also an advisor to the Research Network for Philosophy and Technology, which is also one of the organizers of this series of events. So I'm going to give the time to Carl for introducing our two speakers and to continue with the dialogue. So thank you very much, Carl. I think you have to unmute yourself. You've got to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, yeah. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the work that you've done and the work that Ashley Wong has done in helping organize this event. It's kind of a unique thing, and I'm pleased to be involved. So our two dialogue participants are Diane Michelfelder and Shannon Vallor. Diane is, we're all over the world. Diane is in Minnesota, and Shannon Vallor is in Scotland. I am in Colorado right now. I'm not in Beijing. Diane has been is the editor of this volume on a handbook on philosophy of engineering. For a number of years, she was also the editor of the Techné, Research in Philosophy and Technology, which is one of the leading journals in the field, published by the Society for Philosophy and Technology. Shannon Vallor was Diane was a president of the Society for Philosophy and Technology. I don't remember the exact years. Shannon Vallor was also a president for the Society for Philosophy and Technology, and is the author of another book on techno-moral values, published by Oxford University Press, prior to the one that she's editing now that's almost out, the Oxford Handbook on Philosophy of Technology. Let me invite each of you, as you start, to say a little bit more about yourself. I always think that people can introduce themselves better than somebody else can. But we'll start with Diane, simply because the handbook on the philosophy of engineering has anticipated, beat Shannon Vallor's Oxford University Handbook in being published. So it's just a little bit the first published. So Diane, let me turn it over to you. Say a little bit about yourself and introduce us to the handbook that you've edited.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl, for that introduction. Thank you enormously. I have deep appreciation for being invited to be part of this event. And thanks to you also, Yook, for creating the space for this event to happen, and to Ashley also for facilitating things. And thanks to all of you who are listening and participating for showing up. Yes, I would like just to maybe just say one thing about myself. When my career started, I was in California at California Polytechnic State University. And I wasn't interested at that point in time in either philosophy of engineering or philosophy of technology. But I thought, well, given my contextual situation, I ought to develop an interest. And it was shortly thereafter that Carl and Leonard Wax had a, was it an NEH funded? I can't remember.
Yes, it was this National Endowment for the Humanities funded summer workshop.
A summer workshop when Carl was still at Penn State. And I was delighted to be selected for that workshop. The participants, the speakers in it were great. It was a turning point in my academic life. I had not realized just how many continental philosophers, I suppose, were interested in doing philosophy of technology. So I just owe a deep gratitude, for Carl for setting out the trajectory of my intellectual life, which has expanded in a number of ways. And right now I'm teaching digital ethics at Macalester College, which is a small liberal arts college in Minnesota. Would you like me to say anything more, Carl?
Well, tell us a little bit about the handbook on philosophy of engineering.
Yes. So here it is. It is a handbook. Some people have referred to it as a two-hand book because it's pretty, it has 55 chapters and it's pretty heavy to hold up. I've enjoyed so much working with Neelke Doorn on this, who many of you may know. She's at TU Delft and is both a philosopher and an engineer. So we were able to bring our joint perspectives to this volume. And what interested me the most, I mean, I won't go into the table of contents because you can take a look at that for yourself on the link to the volume. But at some point in our conversation today, I think it would be interesting for Shannon and I to have a bit of a conversation about the structural overlap between our two volumes. There's certainly participant overlap. I think there's there's 4 or 5 maybe that I counted, people who wrote chapters for this. Beth Preston, for example, and others who also are writing for Shannon's volume. And Carl has the lead-off article, lead-off chapter rather, in both of them. So maybe I'll just postpone that until later. I did want at some point though to say something about the emergent properties of this volume. And I don't know if that, I think Shannon should introduce herself, and then maybe we can get to the question about what we've learned about the field as a result of editing. Yeah.
All right. Well, then let me turn it over to Shannon.
Hi, thanks, Carl. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. My name is Shannon Vallor. I'm currently at the University of Edinburgh, where I'm the director of the Center for Technomoral Futures, and also a professor in the philosophy department and a chair in the ethics of data and artificial intelligence. Before that, I taught primarily in the United States at Santa Clara University, which is a Jesuit university in Silicon Valley, which had something to do with my interests in technology. But I have a sort of similar backstory to Diane's, in the sense that, like a lot of folks, I didn't come out of graduate school thinking I was going to be a philosopher of technology, in part because of the historical neglect of academic philosophy in the English-speaking world of that field, something we can talk more about, and which I talk about in my introduction to the volume. So I had studied some philosophy of technology in graduate school, but really came out sort of branding myself as a hybrid Husserlian and philosopher of science, and then learned quite quickly that the market for people marketing themselves in that way was extremely narrow, and that no one actually wanted to read Husserl and analytic philosophy at the same time. Lots of philosophers would rather not read either, but certainly not together. And so it was one of those things where I was having a bit of an existential crisis. I was sending out papers that were getting desk rejected, not because they were bad, but because the editors couldn't find anyone who could read both phenomenology and analytic philosophy. So I thought, all right, well, this is going to be an interesting time for my career. And around the same time, I was teaching a course on science, technology, and society at my university, and really kind of struck by how kind of profound and existential and urgent my students' engagement with that subject was, and how their anxieties about their futures with technology and the shape of society with the kinds of technologies that they were reshaping their lives and relationships around. I realized that there was something very urgent to address there. So I wrote a kind of little paper on social media networks and the virtues, and sent it off to a conference in the Netherlands at the University of Twente that I had very little knowledge of and no personal connections with. So this was around 2005, 2006, 2007, probably 2006. I sent it in, and it showed up at the University of Twente, which some of you may know has long been one of the sort of leading international universities producing scholarship in the philosophy of technology. So the workshop was on the good life in a technological age. And so I presented my paper at that conference. And the most striking thing about it was how incredibly warm and receptive and welcoming the community of philosophers of technology was. I suspect, Diane, that you were at that one. If not, it was maybe the next year when I came back. Carl, I met around the same time. Many other fantastic folks. Charles S. Is someone I'll owe for the rest of my life for his enthusiasm and encouragement from day one, from the day I delivered that talk. And there's just a long list of folks who immediately, you have that feeling when you find your people. But I find that spirit of generosity and openness to really permeate the field as a whole, and it affects the scholarship that's done in this field and not just the personal relationships. I think I never looked back from that point on. It was I was a philosopher of technology from that day forward, because the questions that were being asked were so urgent, and also the philosophical community that I found was so enriching and supportive. So the rest of my career then has been kind of working in this field in different ways, often bringing together virtue ethical perspectives on technology, sometimes existential perspectives or phenomenological perspectives, looking increasingly at the role of data, robotics, and artificial intelligence in the kind of ethical landscape. As Carl mentioned, serving as president of the Society for Philosophy and Technology, and before that, serving many years on the board. And so when I was offered the opportunity to edit the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Technology, it wasn't a great time workload-wise, and in fact, it has delayed the appearance of my second monograph by a few years, but I knew it would be worth it because this field really needed to have this kind of resource available to folks. And I knew, many years ago that the philosophy of technology would become an increasingly vital part of contemporary philosophy, and that its neglect was going to be relatively short-lived. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing, I think, an explosion of interest in the philosophy of technology today. I knew that was coming, and I knew this resource kind of needed to be there. So I took the opportunity to help put that together, not knowing that a global pandemic would drop right on our heads as we were in the middle of it. But I'm happy to say that COVID did not succeed in defeating us and taking out the project. It threw a few roadblocks up in our way and slowed things down a bit. But the volume will be out at the end of January. You can actually pre-order it now. I just noticed that today. No one actually told me, but I Googled it and I went online and I saw the cover, which is fantastic to actually see on a website. So yeah, we're just about ready to go. And we have 32 fantastic chapters from leading figures, as well as new and emerging voices in the field. And I'll say a little bit more about that as well. But of course, as Diane said, the first word in the volume after me and my introduction is Carl's chapter, and couldn't think of a better way to start off or a better moderator for this conversation. So look forward to the discussion.
Just one quick comment on both volumes. As a person who's edited big volumes too, I know how much work it is, and I've experienced both help from both Diane and Shannon in my contributions. They were good editors and made good, strong suggestions for how to improve my contributions. And I really learned from my interactions with them and looking at what they're doing in the volumes as a whole. I think anybody who wants to get some kind of general overview, introduction to the field, these two different fields, there's no better place than they could go in these two volumes. So let me turn back to Diane and ask, okay, what do you think is important that you have learned in about the field and in your editing of this volume in philosophy of engineering?
So I think I'll just start by saying something about your chapter, because it kind of provides a launching pad for what I learned. And I should say that what I learned, I didn't expect to learn. Okay, I mean, you can always be surprised by what you learned, and what I learned just kind of emerged from the volume. But Carl's chapter, we have a section. We began our volume with a section on foundational perspectives, and so Carl's was very foundational, at least in the title. We asked him to write a chapter on what is engineering. Okay? And at the beginning of the chapter, Carl indicates that the word engineering is not a rigid designator. And so you can't have, he was arguing, a single definition of what engineering is. There are options for defining it, and he decided to go with a survey of the pros and cons of looking at engineering as a profession, looking at engineering as a design, etc. And for me, what emerged in the volume was a way of looking at engineering as an art. It's not one of the ones that Carl wrote about in the chapter, but it just came out through the networking of the contributions. So Neelke and I fretted and fretted and fretted over how best to organize the volume. We were sitting across from one another in her office in Delft, and we came up with a very conventional way of organizing the volume. But emerging from that organization was an emphasis on creativity, an emphasis on looking on discovery, on thinking of creativity even as an engineering virtue, the role of aesthetics, bouncing off of that, what is the role of aesthetics in engineering programs? Is how do you look at the creativity that is an inherent part of engineering design? And so that emerged, as did, you might say, the normative aspects of all engineering designs. And when you look at the normative aspect of engineering in that way, then the boundary between engineering and ethics starts to get kind of fuzzy. But for me, what the most important thing was that I learned was just a way in which to look at engineering as an art and what might be gained from that perspective. Yeah.
Okay, let me turn to Shannon. And so what are the most important things you think you learned from doing your volume on philosophy of technology?
Yeah, I learned two things that form a kind of paradox, or at least an interesting tension that I didn't expect. And I think the first thing, I think I knew that each of these things were true in some sense, but they came out in sharp relief in the process of editing the volume. And one is that the field is even deeper and richer than I had understood going into the project. But the other thing I learned is that the field is also in another way still very, very young. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean. But let me start with the first point. As has been said already, I've been working as a philosopher of technology for about 15 years, had served on the board of the society and president during that time, attended countless conferences and workshops for philosophers of technology. And yet none of those had collectively given me as full a grasp of the scope and depth of this field as editing this volume. Each chapter in this volume is really its own world of knowledge. And seeing how intellectually rich the individual contributions are and the staggering breadth of their scope, from talking about fingerprinting techniques in colonial India to the relationships we form with virtual assistants in our homes, from thinking about how engineering design drives knowledge production in nuclear fusion experiments, to the role of science fiction in understanding or shaping our understanding of the sustainable futures we might enjoy with technology. It really left a staggering impression to just see how wide-ranging and deep the explorations were. And having to knit a story together then in the introduction that would encompass all of that was an enormous and daunting intellectual task, and one that ended up being one of the most worthwhile that I've taken on in some time. So I think editing a volume like this forces you to really grapple with your field as a whole and try to wrap your mind and your ideas around it in a way that will never be adequate or complete, but the mere attempt is an incredible learning exercise. So that was something that struck me. But at the same time, editing this volume taught me how young this field still is, by which I mean how much we still lack a common vocabulary and distinctive set of approaches and standards. There is a vast amount of diversity in philosophical style in the work. Readers who are used to reading in a narrow section of the philosophical tradition will absolutely encounter readings that are written in a way that they haven't seen before. And that's true whether you're coming from the analytic tradition or history of philosophy or the continental tradition or applied ethics. You're going to be pulled up short by some of the approaches that are taken. And in some ways, I think the field of philosophy of technology had established something like the foundations of a distinctive identity in the late 20th century, but it then moved into a radically new phase in this century after what philosophers of technology call the empirical turn. And in this way, I think the field has rewound the clock on itself. It has moved itself back from middle age to adolescence. And what that means is that, the field has reopened a new set of questions about what it is to do philosophy of technology, what it is to be a philosopher of technology. And I think that's a good thing. It's fantastic. I think the field needed not to leave the past behind, but to return to it in a sort of new attitude of youth and possibility, and move forward with it in a new way. And I think the field is still grappling with what that will look like. So I was struck by how many meta questions about the field came out of the contributions in a way that I don't think you see in some other philosophical fields. So the Handbook of Philosophy of Science, if you revised it today, it would not express as many open-ended questions about what it means to do philosophy of science, or what kinds of philosophical tools are best suited for it, or what ends philosophy of science should serve. Now, those kinds of questions hit philosophy of science really hard in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think we're entering a similar period in philosophy of technology where those questions are being asked within the philosophical work itself, just as the demand for this kind of philosophical expertise is skyrocketing, which creates an interesting dilemma, right? How do you define the field for people who, now want to, let's say, hire a specialist in philosophy of technology? Is the field still anchored in the phenomenological foundations of the continental tradition? Or has it somehow crossed the continental and analytic divide? Are the primary ends of philosophy of technology normative or descriptive or both? Or are they kind of conceptual and analytic? Is the current dominance of applied technology ethics in the literature a good thing? Or does it suggest that the field has lost its way from the fundamental philosophical questions it started by asking? Does philosophy of technology have its own politics, and should it? Does philosophy of technology need to be done in a manner that's distinctive from interdisciplinary approaches like science and technology studies? Or should we think of STS, media ethics, information ethics, law, computer science, and other disciplines as inseparable from scholarly expertise in philosophy of technology? All of these questions get asked within the volume itself in a really interesting way, as well as constructive work being done in these chapters on problems in the field. So it's not all sort of meta reflection, but I was struck by how much of that meta reflection was present. So I think the philosophy of technology is at the same time maturing and reestablishing its own foundations at a critical moment. And confronting that paradox was one of the most striking things that I learned editing this.
I really love your metaphor of returning to the being young again, being a kid again in philosophy of technology. I think Yuke's work is a good example of that, if I venture to bring him in here, because Heidegger was one of the big names in the 1960s in getting philosophy of technology going. And yet Yuke's big book, The Question Concerning Technology in China, picks up and rethinks that question in a very different context and it's making that question new again. So I like that metaphor. Let me turn to Diane and ask about what you think is most important that you've learned, and how would you characterize the field? I think we need to also ask, what's the relation between philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology? But let me turn it over to Diane.
Yeah, so I should mention that question, what's the relation between philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology? That was originally going to be my contribution to the handbook. I was going to have a chapter on that very question. And at some point I realized, well, this is going to go well beyond 5,000 words. So maybe I should not write the chapter for the handbook. Maybe I should write another chapter, which I ended up doing. But it just was hard for me to kind of get a purchase also on it. Hard to get a purchase. I mean, if you, going back to what I had said earlier, if you take the idea that there's not a single way of looking at engineering, the way that you choose to look at engineering would then influence what you have to say about the relationship between philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology. So you could say perhaps one way of getting traction on it is to see how there's a kind of a tag teaming, okay, a tag teaming between the two. So philosophy of engineering would be devoted to looking at the practices of professional engineers, the ontological structures of the objects that professional engineers create, and the processes of thinking that lead up to these outcomes. And then philosophy of technology would come along, look at the products of engineering, evaluate them, okay? And so that's where the applied ethics part comes in that Shannon was talking about. Evaluate them, look at the impacts, and then you kind of feed that back into engineering. I don't know if that's a good way of looking at the relationship between the two, but it is one way that you could do it. Another way would be, and this is one I think that might be a better way of looking at the relationship as it kind of currently stands, is that philosophy of technology is there at the beginning of the engineering design processes. So rather than tag teaming, it comes in initially and helps engineers to get an understanding on what it is that they are doing, to gain an understanding, and that enriches the outcomes of what they do. So you don't, and that I think is a more impactful perhaps way of understanding the relationship between the two fields. But I want to also go back to something that Shannon had said about the meta level questions, because there are a lot of meta level questions involving philosophy of engineering. So there's been an article published, for example, on philosophy of engineering. I basically could say a field whose time has come. And when you look at the evidence given for why philosophy of technology is a field, the evidence relates to what I would say are a lot of externalities. And so those externalities would be the POET series, Philosophy of Engineering and Technology, that has been edited by Peter Vermaas, that there is a journal devoted, that there's fPET, the Forum on Philosophy and Engineering and Technology. But it doesn't really say, if you have that look at what it takes for philosophy of engineering to be a field, you're not concentrating on the debates and you're not concentrating on the questions. And so I would say that the questions that count and the debates that count certainly have emerged. You can't have a field, I think, without debates, right? Yeah, and disagreements with one another about particular issues. And so just to bring up one that occurs in the book, what about the relationship of repair to engineering, the work of repair? Is that part of engineering, or does that come after engineering, where you're just fixing things and making them work again? That's a debate. Okay. How best to teach engineering ethics? How to change the culture of engineering? There are lots of debates over these. So I think out of the debates, you get a field that is always to some degree, and I don't really have a knockdown argument for this, so I won't give it at the moment, going to be in a beta state. Just as so much of engineering design is in a beta state and will continue to be in a beta state, and users of that technology will then be experimental subjects, perhaps despite their own best interest, that's what you get with philosophy of engineering. And I like that way of thinking about it, because sometimes the whole emphasis on creating a field, why do you want to have a field? Why is it important? All right, I mean, certainly, again, externalities. You want your graduate students to be funded and that sort of thing. But sometimes I think people want a field so they can police the boundaries, and they can say, you're not in this field because you don't think about question X or Y or Z. So I like the idea that it's always slightly beta, always maybe slightly porous, that it slides over, philosophy of engineering kind of slides over into philosophy of technology, can slide over into STS, can slide over into art, as I already have mentioned. Stop. Oh, your microphone is muted. Carl, your microphone is muted.
Okay. Shannon, let me turn back to you and ask how you conceive the relationship between philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology.
Sure, that's
I like this notion of a beta. It's in a beta state, and you slide from one to the other.
Yeah, I like that too, and I think that is a common feature of these fields. If you think about it, there's really nothing in the domain of human attention that moves faster than technology, that changes faster than technology, at least for the past couple of centuries, right? You might argue that this is a kind of recent historical artifact of the industrial age, and that before that there were certainly perhaps changes in the religious or metaphysical worldviews or in politics that moved faster. But today there's really nothing that changes faster for us than the technological landscape. And I think that means that the philosophy of technology is always, kind of chasing something that's already moved ahead. Philosophers, I think, have various degrees of tolerance for that kind of thing. There's a certain kind of philosopher that is really most comfortable with studying something that is sort of historically dead and fixed, so that they can analyze it and take it apart. And it's hard to analyze and take apart something that's moving and changing under your scalpel, under your logical scalpel, right? So I think that's a challenge for a philosophy of technology, is that the thing that we're examining is never holding still. And I think that's true in the philosophy of engineering as well. I think one way of distinguishing them that perhaps you could take, although I don't necessarily think this is a sound or stable divide, but when we think about technology, we think about technology as either artifacts or systems of artifacts that shape our world in particular ways, or processes. Whereas when we think about engineering, we more easily understand it as a social practice, as a human activity, a whether it's a profession or whether it's just a particular approach to the world through the lens of design, it's easy to sort of see engineering as not a thing, but a kind of human, an organized human activity. Whereas when people ask about philosophy of technology, it's left open whether we are understanding technology as a human activity, which I actually think makes perhaps the most sense, or whether we're thinking about technology as something external to us, a set of artifacts or built systems that have their own properties independently of our activity in relation to them. So again, I don't think that's a stable distinction, and I don't think it's always the right distinction to draw, but I do think that that's one way that sometimes people look at this. I also think a kind of distinctive feature of philosophy of engineering, as Diane was suggesting, is this orientation toward design. And I do think design is a key issue in philosophy of technology, but it's not always at the sort of center in the way that, that it is in philosophy of engineering, it seems. But I think, and this is relevant to the debate that Diane was talking about, I do think in both fields, actually, there has been an over-focus on design and an under-development of knowledge about the activity of actually building and maintaining and repairing technical systems. And I think there's a kind of prejudice in the philosophical tradition that I talk about in my introduction that explains that a bit. But I do think that we valorize the designer, the inventor, in a way that I think obscures some of the other aspects of both technology and engineering. And I think, so this focus on sort of innovation in technology, this focus on design and engineering, I think these are kind of parallel focal points that actually leave a kind of penumbra of darkness around them. And I think it's interesting to see how the future of both fields begins to kind of widen its attention to perhaps some neglected features of these dimensions of human activity and experience.
And let me just drop, can I drop one thing onto what Shannon was saying? I also agree that the designer gets valorized. But what when AI is the designer? You know, what about that? And then for both philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology, these are issues involving digital objects, digital processes, algorithmic thinking. These are, you might say, the next things that one would want to address. If there were a sequel, and some people have asked Neelke and myself, will there be a sequel to the Routledge Handbook? And we said no, but if there would be one, then I think it would deal more with those kinds of issues. Can an AI be creative? Right, as Kissinger asked and others in the Wall Street Journal last week, or do we need a new vocabulary really to describe this? I'd be curious actually to hear Yuk's thoughts about the place of digital objects in both philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology. If you care to add something to the discussion at this point.
I think I agree with you, Diane, and I think Yuk's book, The Mode of the Existence of Digital Objects, presents this in a new way too. Mm-hmm. Let me go back to the question of maintenance. I think it was at the second or third fPET meeting, that was in London. I guess that was the second one. That was in London. Jerry Ravitz gave a plenary talk on maintenance, arguing that maintenance was the underappreciated phenomena question in philosophy of engineering. And I don't know that anybody's taken up his challenge to write a philosophy of maintenance or to think about maintenance. So I think Shannon has called attention. Well, you called to attention to with talking about repair. Very interesting topics.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, Diane, about a question of to what extent, noticing that philosophy of engineering emerged among engineers in a much more focused way than philosophy of technology did. The fPET group on philosophy of engineering originated because engineers felt left out of Society for Philosophy and Technology meetings. And they said, well, we're being marginalized. They don't appreciate what engineers have to say about philosophy of technology. So engineers took the initiative of saying, we want to be listened to. We have things to say too. But that raises the question in my mind, to what extent is philosophy of engineering just an ideology of engineering? It's a way of defending themselves. You know, if you had a philosophy of capitalism, it's hard to escape being a kind of ideological defense of capitalism. Do you have any fears that philosophy of engineering is just a way of rationalizing and justifying an activity which should be subject to a lot more criticism?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I'd have to think about it for a while to get a cogent response. Maybe I'll just say one thing. The last chapter in our handbook has to do with reimagining the future of engineering, and it was written by a number of people, a number of co-authors to that chapter. And one of the issues that came up is the persona of the engineer. What kind of personas are there for engineers, professional engineers, and what are the virtues that go with those personas? So you could have one of the ones that was identified was a visionary engineer. Another one that was identified was the engineer as expert. And that part of the chapter does criticize what it is to be an engineer. So I think that the self-reflection on what it is to be an engineer, what it is to do engineering practice, that is baked into the DNA, I would like to think, baked into the DNA of the philosophy of engineering, and will perhaps increasingly be baked into that DNA. If you accept the idea that engineering ethics as part of the training of engineers, as part of what professional engineers need to adhere to, some will argue you cannot do anything about changing engineering ethics without changing engineering culture per se. And so that the question, how do you change engineering culture? That question is also part and parcel, I would say, of philosophy of engineering. So perhaps for some it's an ideology, but I would say overall for the field, there's more critical reflection.
Shannon, do you have any comments on this topic?
I mean, I think there's a a kind of related set of concerns in the philosophy of technology, although in some ways it's flipped. So philosophy of technology doesn't begin with technologists trying to draw philosophical attention or contribute their voices. Philosophy of technology begins with philosophers, often who know relatively little about the kind of inner workings of various technical systems. And so today, I think what you're seeing is, after the empirical turn, as we've called it, a term which, if you're unfamiliar with it, is explained in several of the early chapters of the book, because it's a kind of critical pivot point in the history of philosophy of technology in the early 20th century, where under the influence of a number of persons, the field really started kind of looking at more concrete socio-technical phenomena and artifacts and systems and practices, and being driven more by the empirical evidence of how these actually systems function and the effects that they have, than by a sort of philosophical armchair speculation about the meaning of technology, which is not to diminish actually the value of reflective or even speculative philosophical attention, but the balance shifted towards this empirical approach. And what that meant was a lot of philosophers increasingly becoming conversant with, deeply informed about, and in many cases even embedded in socio-technical organizations. So philosophers of technology working in engineering schools and departments, or working in computer science, or working alongside technology developers and deployers in real world settings, looking at, from an empirical standpoint, how, for example, a particular kind of robot in a nursing home is interacting with patients, and what sorts of phenomena are emerging from that. These sorts of changes started happening in philosophy of technology. And so the advantage of this, right, is that a lot of the work that comes out of philosophy of technology in the 21st century is more informed by the knowledge and experiences of technology developers, researchers, and users. But it faces that same risk of capture that Carl, you were talking about, sort of the capture of the critical function of philosophy. If philosophers get too close to the technology and to the people who control the power to decide what technology is and how it's used, and what kinds of technology will receive attention and investment. If philosophers become too embedded in those networks, do they lose their sort of critical ability to sort of stand back and point out what's missing or what's neglected, or what's not being valorized that needs to be? And I think that's a moment that philosophers of technology are still working through as well.
It's interesting to note that the empirical turn originated in a technical university, and it clearly was used as a response to some of the claim that philosophers of technology didn't know the inner workings, the inside the black box of technology, was a defensive mechanism. Now, it could have, that defensive mechanism can have some benefits to philosophy, but we need to try to think, I think, more critically about our own origins in philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology and the empirical turn, and to what extent is philosophy captured. I like. There's always the problem of regulatory capture when we try to regulate well-established phenomena in the study of the regulation of technology, the control of technology, that the regulators are so committed to the particular technology that they don't reflect more general concerns and issues. And the question of, let's turn back to the question of power. What role does power play in both of these two volumes, in philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology?
Okay, I'll just say that it's there. We don't have a specific chapter in the handbook on engineering as power, but there is a chapter by Falkenberg on the political side, okay, of engineering. So we have that, and then there's also a number of chapters on engineering and social justice, where power, of course, plays a very intrinsic role. But, you know, it leads up to a question. I haven't had a chance to read this article yet. A student of mine called my attention to it last week. It said, AI now has the power to design cities. Should we let it? So who is that we? Should engineers refuse to design an AI that would design a city? Should that be left to regulators? What's the role between engineering and the regulatory environment? The regulatory environment often comes along too late. Can engineers stop something sooner? Shannon had a little piece on the Philosophy On series about GPT-3. How do we think about GPT-3 when so many, even my students are attributing intentionality and something like a mind and something like intelligence to GPT-3? I think those attributions are mistaken, but maybe it points in the direction of, do we need to think in different ways about what it is to be intelligent?
What is this thing you're referring to? I don't know. GPT-3?
GPT-3.
What is that?
Oh, okay. Well, Shannon wrote for this. Philosophers On is a blog, right? That asks for contribution.
Actually, I think you're talking about the piece that I wrote for Noema magazine, which I think got picked up in a few other places.
Okay.
So the Noema magazine is published by the Bergeron Institute. But anyway, to answer the question, Carl, GPT-3 is a part of a kind of new class of computer models, what are called large language models, based on a particular kind of design of that was pioneered by large computing companies that hold massive amounts of data, like Google and OpenAI. OpenAI is the creator of GPT-3, which is the latest iteration of what are called sort of language transformer models that basically generate. So in short, what GPT-3 does is generate text or other kinds of symbols. It can actually generate computer code as well. But it will generate a sort of meaningful or apparently meaningful string of symbols in response to a directed prompt. So if you say to GPT-3, write me an essay on consciousness, you will get something of roughly essay length in which the word consciousness appears a lot, and parts of that will appear meaningful. And it does so by digesting a massive, massive corpus of text, some of which has been about consciousness, and it synthesizes and analyzes patterns within that corpus, and then sort of reworks them and regurgitates them in a textual artifact. And what has struck people about GPT-3 is, oh, if I ask it to write me an essay about soup, I get some interesting claims about soup that are coming from this AI. So this AI is clearly able to think about soup. As Diane points out, this is mistaken. This is not what is happening. There is no mind behind GPT-3. It is a mathematical blender. You just pour a bunch in, blend it up, and then the slurry comes out, and some of the slurry will taste good and some of it will be nonsense and you'll want to throw it out. There's a lot of human curation that has to happen with GPT-3 to pick out anything you would actually want to use. But it produces that illusion. It's like a hyper version of Eliza, right? It produces this illusion of sentience and understanding.
And can be used a lot really for limited purposes such as marketing. So you could prompt it, say, to write a press release about this event, and it might do so in a very convincing way that you couldn't tell the difference between whether it was written by a human being or an AI. And what the slurry that Shannon refers to, all the parameters, they all come from the web. So that's its source. It isn't as though you have to train it along the way that machine learning, normally conventional machine learning has to train an algorithm. It just basically trains itself. And since it can also write computer code, there is a question of whether it would put some software designers, whether they'll be replaced by, not by GPT-3, but possibly by successors of GPT-3 that are going to be even smarter and smarter. So we raised the question, if a student writes an application essay for a college, is it important that it come from that student, that it be original, that student be the designer of their application essay for college? Or could a student just say, okay, here are a few, write me something, GPT-3. How would I know?
I'll also add,
yeah, go ahead.
Just very briefly, that because it's trained on the web, of course, if you ask it about the role of women in society, or to give a very specific example, the computer science and philosophy researcher Abeba Berhana asked it to write an essay about Ethiopia, and what it produced was horrifying in its reproduction of falsehoods and malicious stereotypes. And this is quite typical, of course, of all kinds of language transformers and generative models that are based on this kind of indiscriminate ingestion of massive corpuses of data. And so the other concern, and something that I was really focused on in the piece that Diane mentioned, which I think has been now put in the chat, the link to it, was really what it says about the potential decline of human discrimination and human value judgments and human discernment in thinking and in cultural production. And I think that was what Diane was just sort of gesturing to as well, right? Does it matter if the element of human discernment is missing, as long as we are willing to accept the content that is spit out?
That was a pretty lengthy, we gave a lengthy answer to your question, but I think it's important because it is an area, certainly this is not discussed in our handbook. And I don't think there's a chapter in Shannon's on that, but it raises the question, again, going back to of digital objects and the place of thinking about them and computer science, and you might say in general, within the philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology.
There's let me pick up a comment from a chat. Actually, one of my students from Renmin University, Yinwan, types in, he calls it a parlor trick. It's a parlor GPT-3.
Actually, Carl, that's a quote from the essay.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, I think he just typed in the first.
He picked it up.
One of the paragraphs.
I like that phrase.
I mean, but it is more than a parlor trick, as I kind of go on to point out. I mean, it is a parlor trick, but it's also more than that. And the question of what it means for the future of technology and artificial intelligence is quite interesting. I'll take the opportunity to promote, we're actually going to have an event on the ethics of large language models here at the University of Edinburgh at the Center for Technomoral Futures on December 7th. So if you want to attend, I'll put a link to the registration in the chat if anyone's interested, but it's open to the public.
It'll be a Zoom.
Yeah. Yes.
Like this. Okay, yeah. Great.
And it's a conversation between our new incoming faculty member, Dr. Atuza Keserzada, who has dual degrees actually in philosophy and applied mathematics, and who will be in conversation with Yasin Gabriel, who is an ethics and society researcher at DeepMind, which is one of the, of course, leading AI companies that's actually pursuing, these kinds of techniques as along with others. So it'll be an interesting conversation.
Let me also bring in another comment or question from the Q&A. Janis Spanke asked, I would like to dig deeper into your point of who is the we when it comes to regulation and control of AI. You said that the regulation environment always comes too late. For me, that resembles the Heideggerian phenomenon, prolegomena, that philosophy always comes too late when he uses the metaphor of the Minervan owl. So should we rather follow a materialist philosophical path towards AI than an idealist path? Diane and Shannon, if you can pick up on, I think it's the fourth question in the Q&A, and respond to Janis.
Well, I guess I would like to know a little bit more about what would be considered the idealist and the materialist approach here.
Well, abstract from that, can you say more about the problem of the we? What is the we? This is a problem, as you'll probably remember, Diane. This is one that Ivan Illich was often driving home. Who is the we?
Yeah.
That we often say that technology is helping us become better, or it's improving humanity as a whole. Who is the we? People like to hide behind that we.
Yes, I agree that people hide it behind the we. It's maybe my most frequent comment that I make on student papers, particularly in digital ethics. When students talk about society, I say, what society are you talking about? When they say we, I say, who is indeed this we? So like I said, I hadn't read the article yet that I referred to. Should we stop it? I don't know how the person who wrote the article answers the question of we. So this might appear to be punting on the question, but since I hadn't read it myself, I would just say it's important. So bouncing it up then I guess maybe to the meta level, it's important to clarify who is we. It's always important to do that. We could mean a collection of white males, for example. And so it's always important to get a critical, have one's critical ears and eyes attuned when you hear that word. And so whoever asked the question, I think it's important to kind of call this out.
I gave a talk in Adam Briggle's class on climate change yesterday, and day before yesterday. And I said, we are creating the Anthropocene. And one of the students hit me immediately. Who's the we? What do you mean? She was from Pakistan. She said, are we part of this? Who's the we that's creating this Anthropocene?
I'll jump in here. Yeah, Carl, because you had asked earlier what role power plays in our analyses. And, in the volume. And so we have an entire section of the handbook. The section structure isn't visible online yet. If you go onto the website that has all the chapters, they appear just a list of 32 chapters, but they're actually structured into different subsections. So we have a section of chapters devoted specifically to technology, power, and politics. Although it's interesting because these power questions and these we questions appear in other chapters and other sections. So there's really no containing the power question to just a subset. Whenever you're talking about technology, you're talking about a form of power. And new technologies are introducing new forms of power, which always raise new ethical and political questions, as well as questions about knowledge and questions about the shape of the future. And it's funny because the first chapter in that section is from Adam Briggle on philosophy of technology as politics. And that's one of the chapters that really reflects kind of at a meta level on what are the politics of philosophy of technology itself? And do we recognize those politics? And when we say we, right, as philosophers of technology, are we thinking about what we mean and whose interests are we capturing in our own analyses? And I think that was, again, one of those chapters that, because when let me step back a bit, when I developed the sketch for the handbook, I had a rough idea of the kinds of themes I wanted to talk about, but I also wanted to leave individual contributors a significant amount of leeway to propose their own ideas, because the Oxford handbooks aren't an encyclopedia. They're not intended to sort of be a summary of what has gone on in the field to date or what particular concepts mean. They're intended to each offer sort of new, groundbreaking contributions to the field. So when I asked Adam for a chapter, I actually asked him, I think, for something quite different. And he proposed this reflection on philosophy of technology as politics instead. And I immediately said, yes, that is what we need. And it's because these we questions are as you say, perpetual and often asked in an uncritical way. And philosophy in particular has a bias towards universalizing narratives. It's not alone in this. But certainly it's profoundly, at least the history of Western philosophical thought has certainly been guilty of universalizing narratives that subsume humanity under the umbrella of European, Greek and European history, Greek and European norms, Greek and European political structures. And so we haven't gotten past that yet. But there are some, emerging directions of inquiry, decolonial AI research, or Alison Adam has a chapter following Adams on post-colonialism and technologies of identification. There's attempts to kind of more critically interrogate these really lazy invocations of the we that philosophers historically, myself included more than once, right, have taken on by thinking of how easy it is to speak of humanity and imagine you're simply representing an extension of yourself and those who you know and interact with, when that is never going to reflect the human family as a whole.
Let me venture to pick up a couple of other comments from the Q&A. Pak Hong Wong says that I'm curious if the negligence of repair and maintenance in philosophy of engineering and philosophy of technology arises from the specific philosophy cultural background that promises innovation, creation, originality. I think both of you have said, essentially agreed with that there's a kind of prioritizing of creativity that can lead to a neglect of the question of maintenance.
Can I say something in response to that?
Sure.
So this is actually where my first, where the introduction to the volume starts, is with a reflection on this particular prejudice. I don't phrase it at first as a prejudice against repair and maintenance, although I come back to that at the end of the introduction, I think. But it really was on my mind when I wrote the introduction. I was really thinking about this sort of narrow focus on design and creation and what it leaves out. And I was also thinking about the historical neglect of technology as a subject of philosophical interest, something that is periodically attended to in German-speaking philosophical works, for example, of the 19th and 20th century, but in the English-speaking world and even in Germany and other places is really not sort of, for all that technology means for human activity and human experience, it should have played a much larger role in the history of philosophy than it has. So I wanted to talk about that and explain that. And in thinking about it, I don't even know how I happened across it, but I happened across this passage in Aristotle, and it just hit me over the head like a ton of bricks. It just struck me. It's a passage where he talks about the craftsmen, the practitioners of Techné, and whether they will be admitted to citizenship in an ideal society. And we're all well aware of the prejudice against Techné in relationship to other forms of knowledge and wisdom in Plato and Aristotle. But what's interesting is we tend to have this idea that it's because the Greeks, and in the Platonic tradition anyway, devalued the body and devalued the material world and had this sort of prejudice where what we need to be operating in is as much as possible is the ideal domain of abstraction, mathematics and abstract philosophical contemplation, that these are the highest levels of understanding. So we've got this narrative that explains why technology is of little interest. But I found this passage in Aristotle, and there's nothing said about this kind of Platonic prejudice against the body. It's not reproducing that at all. What he talks about is the relationship between technology and service to others. And of course, if you've done any reading in technology studies outside of philosophy, Ruth Schwartz-Cowan and a number of other sort of figures, that of course there's a lack of understanding of the role that technology has always played in the domestic sphere and in the family, right? In the earliest parts of human experience, technology doesn't live in the city. Primarily, technology lives in the home, where people's needs are met through tools for hunting, for planting, for sewing, for filtering, for cooking, right? Technology is originally a domestic phenomenon, a way of serving and caring for others in one's family and community. And what you read in this passage of Aristotle is how much that is the source of his rejection of technological expertise from the proper focus of citizens. It's because of Aristotle's overemphasis on agency and independence and a kind of patriarchal focus on control and as opposed to service as a kind of feminized virtue, the service and care of others. And so he just says that if we just can't have anyone involved in citizenship, they can even be non-Greeks, maybe, as long as they're not within the ranks of people who devote themselves to the service and care of others. And so I want to come back to this notion of repair and maintenance that Pac is asking about. I think that's actually part of where this prejudice comes from. It's because repair and maintenance is harder to separate from the service and care of others that we have devalorized in society, and particularly in philosophy in the West since Aristotle.
We have a question about, can you give a citation for that? And have you written on that? You've written on that, obviously, in the intro.
I'll find it and put it in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to second this. There's a book called Repair. It's a very short book. I've used it in class, but basically the idea is that repairing is always women's work. You have women are darning the socks, right? They're putting the buttons back on the shirts. They're doing all of that kind of mending, not simply of material objects, but when relationships break down, it's often the job of women to see whether they can be repaired. And so I think this is a heavily gendered issue, but it gets to the heart of what PAC is thinking about.
Pulling back to the early origins of philosophy of technology, this was a point that Lewis Mumford made repeatedly, that technology includes basket making, weaving, lots of domestic activities. He says, why do we exclude these things when we're talking about, for him, he used techniques. Techniques is a much broader concept. It includes roads and the use of roads, and paths, even as a kind of techniques. So there was efforts to call attention to that, even by such a male chauvinist pig as Lewis Mumford. What would you like to say more? We only have about 30 more minutes left. What are some things that you would like to emphasize, either one of you, or questions you would like to ask to each other?
I guess I have one for Shannon. I'll start out here. It was funny. I'm teaching right now a course on philosophy and play, and the subject is primarily configured through the lens of 20th century continental philosophers. So we're looking at Merleau-Ponty, we're looking at Deleuze, also looking at Eugen Fink. And a former student of mine called my attention to the fact that another former student of mine, now at DePaul in the PhD program, is working on philosophy of laughter. Okay, working on philosophy of laughter. So I thought, maybe I can ask him to give a guest talk. It worked out because he wanted to talk about Bergson, and Bergson counts as 20th century for philosophy of laughter. Okay, and we exchanged syllabi. And the first sentence of my syllabus, first two sentences were, philosophy is serious stuff. When was the last time you heard someone say that Aristotle, he's just so hysterical? And when my former student at DePaul sent me his syllabus, it was exactly the same first line. Philosophy is just a serious activity. And I got a laugh out of the fact that we had both started out in the same way. And I kind of feel that for our volumes, it's the same, a little bit the same too, in terms of the buckets as to how we have organized our material. And so, we have ontology, we have epistemology, we have values coming after that. You have a separate section, as you said, on politics, and then at the end, there's kind of more looking into the future. And I guess I'm wondering, is that, because I've wondered it about myself, is philosophy of engineering as a field, is it anchored in those traditional buckets, or could things be organized in some other way? How did you get to that bucket way of organizing that? That we did.
It's a great question. And I think it was very much a strategic decision, but one that was made with the knowledge that it excluded other possibilities. And so it was somewhat conservative as a structural choice, in that it reproduces, in certain ways anyway, the traditional kind of categories of philosophical interest reflected in the European and Anglo philosophical tradition. And it would have been in some ways better, I think, to organize it differently in a way that broke down or destabilized those buckets, as you call them. But there's a strategic reason I chose not to do that, which I'm still happy with. Maybe later, someday, I'll look back and say, nope, should have done that differently. But I was aware of this trade-off when I made it. And the trade-off was strategic in this way. As I've mentioned, and as is discussed by a number of folks in the opening chapters of the volume, philosophy of technology has been really, even the 20th century work that was done has been broadly neglected by academic philosophers more generally. Outside of our sort of familiar community of philosophers of technology until very recently. So particularly, I'll take the American academic environment as an example, because of course, I spent most of my years in that environment, although it's also true in the UK, and in many places outside of, let's say, the Netherlands, right, where you have a different paradigm for reasons we can talk about. But in the UK, in the US, if you go into an elite philosophy department and say, or really any philosophy department, and say, who here has an AOS, an area of specialization in philosophy of technology, they'll just look at you like, what? That's just not a thing. I mean, they may know there's philosophy of technology, but it's not one of the things you hire in, right? There's a philosopher of science in every department. There's there's multiple epistemologists or metaphysicians. In a large enough department, you'll have someone who does aesthetics. In a large enough department, you'll have someone who does philosophy of cognitive science. In every department, there's somebody who's going to do ethics, philosophy of mind, history of philosophy. Philosophy of technology isn't on that list in most departments, particularly English-speaking departments that are anchored in the analytic philosophical tradition, which means that there's a profound ignorance of philosophy of technology and where it fits, where it belongs. And what I wanted to do was write a structure for the handbook that would allow people who are just now recognizing that philosophy of technology has a place in the discipline, a central place, to figure out how to map philosophy of technology onto the landscape with which they're already familiar. So understanding that philosophy of technology has contributions in metaphysics, that it has contributions in epistemology, that it has contributions in aesthetics and in ethics, and in fact, that it's almost coextensive with the discipline in this way, was something I wanted to be able to illuminate very, very readily with that structure. But as you say, in doing that, you reproduce a structure that itself deserves critical attention. And that's something I think I gestured at a little bit in the introduction, that actually what we need is the future of philosophy, not only to embrace philosophy of technology and incorporate it into itself, but rather to use it as an opportunity to take a new critical look at what philosophy itself is and what its relationship is to human knowledge and experience. And so I look to the future generations of philosophy of technology to do that. So the sort of strategic move is to anchor it to philosophy as it exists today. But the next step is to, in a sense, free it from that legacy so that it can develop in new ways.
Yeah, I think that that is an important kind of rhetorical or strategic move to make, just for further evidence of the neglect, I guess you could say, or need to catch up in American universities per se, is that when you go on to the job market, you're likely to look at something called fill jobs, and you can search in fill jobs for jobs in applied ethics or epistemology or critical race theory or something along those lines. But I believe, and maybe it had changed, the last time we hired was last year actually, that philosophy of technology doesn't appear on the list. You have to type it in separately. And it astounds me to some degree, but it also makes me happy that with the rise of data science and AI, and also objects like Alexa and autonomous vehicles and all of this, that now maybe philosophy of technology will start to take on more of a prominent role. And so there were last year a number of positions that in the US, more, and by a number, it's still a real small number, but it's more than there has been in the past, available if you are doing digital ethics or ethics of AI. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I'll also add that, so I'm at the University of Edinburgh, and my focus is ethics of data science and AI. But we're hiring this year for a philosopher of technology. And it does not have to be someone doing applied AI ethics or data ethics. It's a philosopher of technology, broadly construed. And it's not a sort of temporary fill-in spot for somebody to just teach a class. It's a lecturer, senior lecturer, open-ended contract. And that's, I think, indicative of this kind of new moment for the field that we're entering, where that neglect is beginning to be addressed. And I hope that will continue to be the case.
Let me pick up a couple of more comments from the Q&A. Daryl Farber remarks about the issue of maintenance. It's not just it's not exclusive to women. It's something that rolls in society. Men repair the automobile, repair the roof, repair the sewer line, etc. So when you're talking about big technology rather than domestic technology, it's a social structure as well as conceptual distinctions.
But it's worth asking, right? Why are those social roles devalorized
Exactly.
relative to others, right? Why are the mechanics of the world treated as somehow lesser contributors to the economy, to social well-being? Why are they seen often in a contemporary culture as of less economic and social value than a software engineer?
Yeah, why is repair not seen as more of a creative activity?
Mm-hmm.
This certainly came to the fore a little bit with the result of the pandemic. The essential workers were the workers who were doing the lower appreciated, lower valorized activities. Shannon, could you take a look at the one? There's the last one in the Q&A, because it's directed a little bit to your issue about AI. It's from Christina Villanov, and she says, given the current climate and the possibility of a neoliberalized metaverse, inquiry into problems and immersive technology seems warranted and fast. My question, I suppose, is what are some underrepresented fields within the underrepresented subjects within the fields of philosophy of technology and philosophy of engineering? I guess both of you have talked a little bit about underrepresented fields, but we might kind of circle back to that.
Yeah, and as Christiana points out, this is related to our discussion of the tendency of philosophy to always be coming a little bit too late. And there was actually in the early 21st century, there was actually a lot of work done on anticipatory philosophy of technology and of kind of futures-oriented philosophy of technology, sort of thinking about kind of trying to get ahead of that. And one of the things that happened is there were a few kind of moments where people got burned by that approach of trying to get philosophical speculation going before the phenomenon had fully arrived. So nanoethics and philosophy of nanotech became a huge thing for about 5 years, and people were pouring grant money into it, and people were, turning their research agendas toward it. And there was an expectation that nanotech was going to open philosophical questions that didn't get opened for technical reasons internal to what nanotech can realistically do in the world that we have. And so that some of those research lines sputtered out. So Christiana also mentions immersive tech. And one of the interesting things is, I remember one of our colleagues that we all know and love, John Sullins, was working on a book on the philosophy of Second Life. When Second Life, for those of you who are too young to remember, was in a sense the metaverse before Zuckerberg thought of it. And Zuckerberg didn't think of it, he took it from Neil Stephenson. But in any event, Second Life already existed, was the first attempt to sort of create the metaverse based on what Snow Crash had predicted. And for a while, it was going to be the place where we were all going to be taking our future university courses in Second Life. And we were all going to be working in Second Life. Everything you're hearing Zuckerberg say about the metaverse has literally already been said about Second Life. And it had a boom and bust cycle. And so, of course, I've joked to John that it's time to pull the Philosophy of Second Life book off the shelf. But there's a real question about whether, immersive technology is really here, whether it's just a marketing scheme by Zuckerberg to try to distract us from the Facebook papers. And so I think there is this kind of problem of getting there too soon, as opposed to getting there too late. And also getting there too soon means often you just don't know what you're talking about, as what happened in the sort of nanoethics cycle, where people wanted to talk about the danger, what they saw as the very real dangers of gray goo incidents, where nanobots escape and turn all matter into unrecognizable goo. And so you really don't want to expend a lot of philosophical energy on things that may simply not happen. So that's one thing I wanted to say. On underrepresented things, though, I think what we can say is it's not just about what technologies are coming that we haven't talked about yet, but what aspects of those technologies have we not looked at yet? I think the care and maintenance and repair element is underrepresented, as we've said. I think we are also needing to focus more, and certainly Carl will understand this because he's been a pioneer in this area for decades. We need to get out of this kind of parochial, Anglo-centric, Eurocentric lens on technology and look at how other cultures, regions, communities have thought about technology, incorporated technology into their worlds. And so the kind of intercultural and cross-cultural philosophical understanding of technology is woefully inadequate. And people like Pak-Heng Wong, who's in the chat, have done some fantastic work in that domain, but we need a lot more of it.
Yeah, let me add on to that, because one of the questions that Carl had asked us to think about was what we would do differently about editing the handbook if we had to go back in time and do that. And Pak also has a chapter in the Routledge Handbook, which is really a terrific chapter on global engineering ethics, where he questions the notion of whether there could be or should be such a thing. It was really important for Neelke and myself to have a robust representation of women authors in the handbook. When we had pitched the idea originally to Andy Beck, we had a wonderful editor. We had said we wanted 40% of the chapters. That's what we had hoped for it to be written by women. And I haven't actually added it up. Since the last chapter has, like I said, multiple, 18 or so co-authors, and there are a number of women represented there. I think we got pretty close to that 40%. And part of why we wanted to have it was to inspire future graduate students to see how many women are actually doing philosophy of engineering, and then just to reflect the fact to a wider audience that women are doing this work. So if we had to do it again, we would expand, I would want to expand the intercultural perspectives. We have, in the handbook, there are a couple of chapters devoted to non-European, non-Eurocentric perspectives, but I think we could have done or should have done a better job, and that's what we would certainly strive to do that if there were a sequel to the handbook. Not have them sequestered in particular chapters, right? Not have them sequestered, but have it spread out throughout the volume.
Yeah, I'll say that's exactly what I think is probably the greatest deficit in the handbook that I've edited as well. It's similar to Diane. We wanted to make sure that the volume represented women's contributions to the field as well. So I think we have 14 women authors out of, I think, a total of 34 contributors, which is not 50%, but it's not far off. I also wanted to incorporate the perspectives of newer and emerging voices in the field. And that's actually a challenge for these handbooks, which are supposed to kind of represent the kind of leading, most kind of established scholarly contributions in the field, which will obviously bias you towards, representatives of a philosophical tradition that, 50 years ago was almost exclusively dominated by white men. And so I think this is something that I was able to do, was to invite, some very new voices in the field to contribute. But where the volume is really lacking is that element that really sort of goes beyond the sort of traditional philosophical lenses of the European tradition in a substantive way. Similar to Diane, there's a great chapter in the volume from Pack on why Confucianism matters for the ethics of technology. And folks like Charles S. and others are really kind of, and certainly the contribution from Julia Gibson and Kyle Powys-White are bringing together a number of different global perspectives on their subject matter, but it's really not woven into the volume in as radical and groundbreaking a way as I would have liked to do in retrospect.
Since we're getting close to the end here, I want to pick up another 2 comments from the Q&A, and maybe it'll be our last response. Levi Checkert says, he asked whether if expanding things can lose a focus. He says the flexibility and underdefinition of philosophy of technology reminds me of debates in STS about the state of the discipline or the field or the area of study. As philosophers of technology gain recognition in STS, are we in the risk for the field becoming too broad to be meaningful, or will it suffer the disciplinary gatekeeping that other disciplines offer experience, or will it be able to repair or retain its creative flexibility? And the second one is from Giovanni Frigo at ITAS in Germany. Can both presenters share their thoughts about a past, present, future relationship between philosophy and ethics of technology and environmental ethics? I do note that that's something that hasn't been mentioned so far today. Thank you in advance, he says. This event is very helpful for younger researchers. So environmental ethics and problems of keeping enough focus that we're really have something to say.
Maybe I can just take up the question about the focus, because that is something that I've thought about. If there are too many open questions, then it seems as though the field might not have a focal energy that would be enough to sustain it. So I like to think of philosophy, like I said earlier, philosophy of engineering as always being in a beta state, but there might be something that you get to a point where there's so many open questions, so many unresolved issues, that it just starts dissipating, okay? Kind of like the fog. And if there are too many open questions, then you can't really think of the field as making progress. And so that, to me, presents an open question. When we think of what it is to have an academic field of any sort, do we want to have progress? Do we want to demonstrate that there's progress in a field in terms of answering questions, of putting certain questions out of play? I mean, philosophy of technology has certainly put, I would say, out of play the question as to whether a technical object is value neutral. So that's no longer the subject of vital debate within philosophy of technology. But is it the case, though, that maybe you can count progress in terms of refining a question, in terms of making a question deeper? Again, as I said, these are open questions for me, but I understand a worry that at the beginning of a field, there's a lot going on, and if too much goes on, then maybe the field just kind of implodes in itself. I don't think that's going to happen to either philosophy of engineering or philosophy of technology, but I understand the concern.
Yeah, and I'll add that those very questions are grappled with by a number of authors in the opening section of the Oxford Handbook. We in addition to Carl's chapter, we have contributions from Peter Paul Verbeek, Martin Franzen, and Don Howard that are all actually in different ways grappling with, I think, that very question of what it means to do philosophy of technology, what kinds of methods are legitimate, what gives it the cohesion that allows it to actually move forward. And I think it would be worrisome if philosophers of technology weren't asking those questions. So in a way, the fact that those questions are being grappled with is for me, sufficiently reassuring. And I do think that in general, philosophical domains of inquiry need a healthy amount of that to stay vital. So I think if they stop asking those questions altogether and everything is assumed to have been settled and scoped out, then I think often the field loses something important. So there's a kind of equilibrium that needs to be struck, where there's a sufficient amount of critical inquiry and re-examination and iteration that the field can grow, but not so much that it just comes unglued. And as Diane suggested, I think we're actually well on our way to a field which is experiencing a healthy amount of critique, but not so much that it is in danger of splintering apart. I do think that the relationship between philosophy of technology and STS is always going to be vital and always going to be contested in a good way. And I think one of the primary distinctions that often gets made within, these communities is STS scholars are used to descriptive analyses that identify relations, that identify omissions, that identify imbalances, but rarely offer sort of prescriptive accounts of how those imbalances must be addressed, or arguments, right, that are promoting a particular claim that then is defended from a number of different objections in the way that philosophers are likely to do. And so there's, I think, likely going to remain that kind of descriptive critical inquiry that STS scholars are really, really good at, and philosophers are good at, but perhaps often distracted by their intentions to make some sort of prescriptive claim or a conceptual claim that they need to sort of defend against all comers. And sometimes that's a useful thing for philosophers to do. And it's good that there is a place to do it in academia. But I do think that philosophy of technology needs to be able to do other things as well. So I think there's a healthy amount of uncertainty and ambiguity about where these boundaries are. And I think they're certainly not clear enough that there is going to be any kind of unhealthy disciplinary gatekeeping that will shut things down and prevent knowledge from flowing across those boundaries. Oh, I'll answer the question on environmental ethics really quick. Yes, this is actually one of those tricky things where technology ethics needs to also engage with environmental ethics, but because environmental ethics already exists as a defined subfield of applied ethics in philosophy, there isn't as much interaction as there ought to be. We do have a section in the handbook on technology, health, and the environment, in which some of these questions get raised. But I think there needs to be a much better integration of philosophy of technology or ethics of technology and engineering ethics. So that's one of the directions I think in which the field can move.
Yeah, and the same, there's one chapter in the Routledge Handbook that's by Andy Sterling that has to do with sustainability. But here again, there could be more across the board, okay, with other topics.
Well, let me offer you the chance for one last wrap-up comment from each of you. Anybody want to go first? I'll make one comment. Yeah, I've been watching the chat, and I'm impressed by the number of Chinese philosophers and students who have participated. I can't tell where all the participants are. I can only tell where the chat people are from that I happen to know. But there's the problem globally of India I think is underrepresented in general. China is becoming more represented, but India is a new area. There's lack of participation from Africa and from Latin America. So there's lots of places that we can grow in getting more participation and contributing to these issues, which are truly transnational in their boundary.
Yeah. So, and let me just add a final thought there that, technology is increasingly a sort of existential issue. Going back to environmental and sustainability questions, we are in a very fragile place as a human family. And whether we have a meaningful future on this planet is in question in a way that it wasn't before the 20th century. As Hans Jonas first recognized that these kinds of questions would come at us. And he knew that in the 70s, but we're confronting them now and living with them. And so philosophy of technology for me is not just an area of academic interest. It's at the sort of existential heart of questions about what kind of future is possible for the human family of 8 billion people on a very fragile planet. And I think this field is arguably having to respond to what Jonas called the imperative of responsibility in a new way, and is only beginning to grapple with that. But I'm very excited to continue to be a part of it and to see the next generations of philosophy of technology emerge and take on that imperative.
Yeah, I would second that. I had a student yesterday who came to an office hour saying, I'm just so inspired by digital ethics. What do I need to do to be a digital ethicist? And I actually suggested that she take some courses in data science. And I don't know if that was the answer that she hoped I would give her, but I put her in touch with someone who actually is at Microsoft on their ethics and society team that is dealing quite a bit with OpenAI. So hopefully he can point her in a better direction than I can. I have just truly enjoyed being a philosopher of technology, and I also look forward to seeing what is next. And sometimes when I think about what might be next, I wonder, and this is really one of these very much open-ended question, does engineering itself need a makeover? Does engineering itself need, this goes back to the question of the definitions, does it need rebranding, so to say? I mean, we think so much of engineering as a problem-solving activity. Who does that benefit? Who does that leave out? If we were to think of engineering as having ethical questions, the big ethical questions, the ones that Shannon is referring to, at its heart, what is it to be a person? What kind of life should I lead? If those were seen as the core questions for engineering, then perhaps the problem-solving aspects could come later and flow out of that. So that's one of the things that I'm working on at the moment, just trying to grapple with that issue. This has been delightful to participate in. Thank you again.
Any last words, Shannon?
No, just that I'm grateful to the audience for showing up and asking such great questions. And it's always lovely to spend an afternoon with you, Carl and Diane. So hopefully we can do it in person soon.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank both of you as well. I've really enjoyed it. I'm stimulated by it. Makes me want to think and work harder and more. I've been doing this for a long time, and I hope I can do it for a few more years. Do you have any final comments?
Right. So first of all, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. I mean, I wish I were able to participate because there are so many questions that also interest me. I mean, I guess the questions are not only about how to do philosophy of technology today, but also how to do philosophy today. Of course, I mean, we can always do history of philosophy, but I guess today to do philosophy may have another meaning. And also if philosophy of technology itself is actually too self-restricting in its definition. And how to enlarge the concept of technology. Actually, our research network has established a journal, a new journal, and the next issue that we are going to have is about the question of technology in Latin America. And we are preparing another issue on the question of technology in India. So I hope that this question can bring us together again to continue our discussion. But it's very late now already here, so I want to thank you, Carl. I want to thank Diane and Shannon for being here to share with us, and also want to thank the City University of Hong Kong for the support. I want to thank Ashley and Edwin for the organization and making this possible, but also to the audience who have been here with us for more than 2 hours. I just want to briefly say that in the next days, we are going to have several events. On the 20th of November, we are going to have a workshop on Hegel, especially on the relation between technology and the state in Hegel's Philosophy of Right on the 20th of November. And on the 24th of November, we are going to have a dialogue with Jean-Luc Barthélemy, one of the one of the leading scholar on Simondon. And on 7th of December, we are going to have a dialogue with Susanna Limbeck, professor at the University of Leiden, on Bernard Stiegler's philosophy of music, a rather interesting subject. So for those who are interested in this event, you can go to our website to sign up for our newsletter, or you can follow up our Facebook pages, and to stay up to date on the upcoming event. So I want to thank again for everyone for being here and for this wonderful discussion. So have a nice day, have a nice evening, and have a wonderful weekend.